All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Leslie Kamphaus, and I am an Associate Course Director of English Composition here at Full Sail University. I have been at Full Sail for about a year now, just a little bit over a year, but I have been teaching writing at the university level since about 2012. And I'm really excited to talk to you today about project-based learning and about, oh, my face froze, about student engagement, because for many years, I spent so much of my time teaching introductory classes where a lot of the time the students that come through my classes that take introductory writing are students that maybe this is one of the first classes they've ever taken in college, and they come in with a lot of preconceptions about what college is going to be like. And I get to say, haha, it's not anything like that at all. It's actually way different. And a lot of the challenge that I work with every day is getting students engaged and interested in something that might not have been their first choice of activity, but that they realize once they start doing it that there's actually a lot of value in what they're learning. And I think that's true of any class, whether it's in a high school or whether it's in a university. So I'm super excited to jump into our content today about project-based learning. Okay, so I wanted to start out by thinking about this question that I think drives a lot of the decisions we make as teachers. How do we get students to care about what they're learning? How do we get them to buy in? And we've all had this struggle, right, as teachers, that we believe in the importance of our subjects, which is why we're teaching them, but our students are not necessarily always as invested in those subjects as we are. So how do we design our courses differently to help them be invested? And think about some of the questions that often come up when we're planning our classes, right? What are we going to cover? And how much information can we fit into the time allotted? Essentially, what are we going to give them? And how are we going to evaluate them to make sure they understand it? And those questions come from a good place, but what ends up happening is that we're giving students a lot of content. We're telling them a lot of things. We're showing them a lot of things, maybe in a lecture or in a reading. And, we're having them reproduce it maybe in something like a test or an essay. But where those more traditional methods of teaching sometimes fall short is that we're delivering a lot of that information and a lot of that testing, but the students are working in a vacuum. They don't have a real audience outside the classroom. And what the research says is that this is not the most effective way for students to learn. For example, I can remember being in math classes growing up, and I was always terrible at math, and learning a lot of formulas and memorizing a lot of steps so I could reproduce them on a test. And my teachers would always kind of reassure me, oh, you guys are going to need this one day. But you know what? It's been 20 something years, and I don't remember how to do any of that stuff because there was no real application there. I was just learning a concept for the sake of learning a concept, but I never saw that concept in action outside the classroom, so I didn't care, so I didn't remember. So project-based learning then takes a different approach, because with project-based learning, instead of teaching students a concept just in this general sense and then testing them to make sure they understand it and kind of promising them that one day this is going to be important, we shift the focus. We want to give them a real world situation where they take that complex concept or skill that we want them to learn and they use it to solve a real problem. And then we help them develop the skills they need along the way to meet that goal. So this way, they understand why they need the skills that you're teaching them, because they have to use those skills to create something, to do something. So they internalize them. And this approach helps students learn more effectively because their learning is grounded in an authentic context, right? They're not learning a math problem just for the sake of learning math. Instead, maybe they're doing some kind of design or engineering project that requires them to use some kind of fundamental concept of geometry or of algebra. Or they're not learning history by memorizing a lot of names and dates and events just for the sake of learning those things. They're actually using that history maybe to craft some kind of a narrative or to solve a problem or to weigh in on some kind of current political issue. This is happening, this is applying to real life. So these more authentic contexts for learning ensures that students are going to take ownership of what they're learning because they're using those concepts to create something and to respond to something real that they care about and that they're invested in. And then finally, the purpose of learning with this approach is transparent from the beginning. You don't have students saying, how are we ever going to use this? Because they're already using it. And that kind of transparency can be really empowering for students because they no longer have the impression that they're doing something just because you, their teacher, are telling them to do it. Your students they're becoming creators. And then your job is to guide them through developing skills that they already know they need. So this approach creates that buy-in for students that's so essential to their learning because they already know why this is so important before they even start doing it. So what does a project-based approach actually look like? Well, first, the project starts out with a challenging question or a goal and then works backwards from there. So what problem are students going to be solving? What's going to change for them? What's going to change because of them? And sometimes that essential question that students are trying to answer, it might be kind of theoretical or it might be service oriented. For example, one project that I came across in my research asked students to create plans for neighborhood community improvement projects based on what they were learning about history. It was for like a middle school history class. And this project started with this essential question, how can we use history to improve the present? Okay, so they're starting out with that question and coming up with goals for how to answer it, how to solve that problem. Sometimes that essential question, that beginning question might be something more technical, you know, how can I create a video game that people will want to play? Either way though, that essential question it's tied to a goal, right? To answer that question, you're going to create this, you're going to make this, you're going to do this. So that question then leads students to create a project that solves some kind of real world problem. And sometimes that might take the form of a specific issue in their community that they're tackling. You know, they might create a public service announcement about some kind of social issue. Or sometimes that real world problem they're solving might be a little bit more self-contained. You know, how can I use this technology to create a song? So in either of those cases, whether we're talking about a question that's more theoretical or whether we're talking about a question that's more technical, students are creating work that responds to some kind of context that exists outside the classroom. And then once they understand the problem they're solving and how they're going to solve it, they're making something, they're creating something. And as they go through those steps of creating it, they're developing those skills that we want them to develop, but they're doing it with a purpose, which means they're going to internalize those concepts more. And then once they have created this project, students then should have the opportunity to present this to a real audience outside the classroom. And this can mean different things depending on the project. This might mean that students create a website that anybody can access, or it might mean that they deliver some kind of a presentation to a stakeholder. At Full Sail, that might simply mean that now they have a video game or a song or an app they created that they can use in their portfolios that they can send out to potential employers. But either way, the point is that these things that students are creating have some kind of real tangible effect. And finally, project-based learning can be collaborative and interdisciplinary. And again, this will depend on the scope of the project and what works best for you and your students, but the potential is there not just for students to collaborate with each other, but for teachers to collaborate as well, so that, you know, maybe students are working on the same project throughout multiple classes. For instance, maybe in a project where students create a website about the history of their community, They might work on the research parts of that project in a history class, but then maybe they, in a digital media class, create videos for that website, but it's all part of the same project. So the opportunities there to create something that's large or interdisciplinary if you have the resources for that kind of scale. So it is very flexible, but that interdisciplinary potential is really awesome. So I want to talk then about some steps for creating a project using this approach. And we want to start with the goal and work backwards, right? So we're going to think about these two questions. What question are the students trying to answer, and what are they ultimately going to create? And starting with this goal will not only help you organize the project, but once you introduce it to students, it helps them get excited about it. So when you introduce the project, you might start with that essential driving question as kind of a brainstorming exercise. Let them discuss the question a little bit and see its complexity. And then once they've had that discussion, then you can introduce the project, right? To answer that question, here's what you're going to create. You're going to make a movie, or you're going to make a political ad, or you're going to make a website with a collection of oral histories about your family, whatever the project is. So pitching it to them with that goal up front can really get students invested in learning. And the next step is you want to lay out the plan for the project and the steps that students will go through to get to this larger goal. And as much as is possible and practical, it's great for this part of the process to be student-led. So once you've introduced that essential question and that goal, then the next question is going to be, well, what do students need to know? What do they need to be able to do to get that project done? And if you can throw this question to the students and let them brainstorm skills that they think they would need or steps that they think they would need to go through to do this project, then not only are your students practicing critical thinking, but ultimately they're asking you for the instruction that you were already planning to provide anyway. And then once you have that student-led conversation about what they need to know, you'll provide them with a clear timeline and benchmarks from the beginning to the end of the project. What do the steps to that finish line look like? What are they going to do along the way? Where are the check-ins? At what points are they being evaluated, and how? And again, this depends on the project and on the specific situation, right? This might mean that you already have a pre-planned schedule of benchmarks that you've created before you even talk about it with the students that you then provide for students and go over. That might mean coming up with these steps with students together as a brainstorming activity and letting the students kind of negotiate where those benchmarks are going to be. So the level of control that you have over this is up to you, but either way, the takeaway is the same. Students know what the steps are going to be, and that keeps them oriented towards that overall goal. And this feeds into providing scaffolding and feedback when students are actually putting this plan into action. So each step of the project should help provide students with those skills and those tools to meet their goal that you discussed at the very beginning. And as they're going through all of those steps and all of that scaffolding, they should get feedback after each one of those steps. So what that feedback looks like is going to depend on your class's specific needs, but it should be geared toward what they can improve as they work on their larger project, right? Here is a smaller goal. Here is how you can improve this piece, and here's how this piece is going to fit into that larger thing effectively. And as you're doing this, there should also be dedicated class time for students to work on their projects. And depending on the needs of your class, this could be an hour a day, or it could be one class period a week, or just whatever makes sense for your project and whatever your class schedule allows for. But it's important to have that in-class face-to-face time while they're working on their projects so that they can collaborate with each other, They can ask questions while they're working, and they can make progress incrementally, because we all know what happens when students procrastinate. It's not fun for the student or for us. So that's a way to kind of keep checking in with them incrementally, so they're not trying to scramble to complete something very large and very complex in just a little amount of time. And finally, this project ideally should end with presentation and reflection. And again, what this looks like is going to depend on your situation. So, for instance, they might be, once they finish their project, they might present it to a stakeholder, right? A business owner or a city council member or whoever it is that can respond to the issue they're raising. They might do something like that. They might publish it on a website. They might present it to their peers in their neighborhood, whatever makes sense for what they're doing. So again, what that presentation looks like depends on what the project is and what's going to work best for you and for your students. But the end of this process, right, where they present this, that's where they get that real life audience. That's where it reinforces that this work they're doing in school matters, not just for the sake of doing it, but it matters in the real world, in a real context. And there are real people that care about this real thing that they made. And after they've done that, the end of this process should also allow them time to reflect on what they've learned and what skills they have now that they didn't have before. And this can be in the form of, it can be a written reflection, it can be a group discussion, it can even be embedded into how they present it. So however you want to do it, this model is flexible and adaptable to whatever kind of project you have to create. You can scale it really large or you can scale it really small. It's going to depend on your students and on what they need. And I do want to go over a couple of examples of just a couple of ways that this approach might look. And I really could go over any number of examples from Full Sail, because our approach to learning here, our whole approach is really project-based. So students are, they create things like video games and apps and music and animation for a big portfolio for their graduation. So every class they take is kind of like a benchmark on the way to a larger final project. But what I want to talk about right now are just a couple of kind of smaller scale examples of different types of assignments that could work with a project-based approach. So this first example, the slang wiki, this is actually a project that I've done at a previous university, but it could also be adapted for a high school classroom easily. And this is one where the essential question is one that's a little bit more philosophical or theoretical. I was really trying to get students to think deeply about why their words matter. So I started off with this essential question: what do our words reveal about our culture? And I had each student pick some kind of commonly used slang word, and they researched it, and they all created this kind of reference site / wiki about common slang words. That was the goal, was that they were going to create this kind of body of information that was going to be online and publicly available. So what I did was I started off with a class discussion where I introduced this essential question: what do our words tell us about culture? And then as I introduced that question, as I introduced that project, as I introduced the idea of this is what we're going to make, then I did what I suggested on the previous slide, and I had students brainstorm about what kind of things they would need to know to complete this project. And they suggested things like, oh, the history of the words, or some demographic information about who uses it most, or, oh, we're going to need some data about how different people in different parts of the world use that word in different ways. And it actually worked out really nicely, because the students were pretty much spot on when they were figuring out what they needed to know with what I had already planned in my head for what I wanted them to know. So it worked out really nicely in that case, but even if in this initial discussion, if students are a little bit off base, you can still guide them toward where you want them to get before you introduce that timeline. And when I introduced that timeline, I broke this project down into steps. So the first thing they did was they did some research about the history of their words and how the definitions of those words changed over time. And then second, I had them research instances of people using the word on different social media sites. And then they had to come up with visual representations of data to reflect what they found in terms of what kinds of people were using the word most, where they were seeing it most often, and where there were discrepancies in terms of who was using that word in different ways. So by this point, that what they were starting to get at was that all of their words had a little bit of controversy behind them. Maybe, maybe those words had classist origins or misogynist origins, or maybe that word started out as a slur, but then was reappropriated as something positive. So as they're doing this research, they're getting feedback with each step, and I'm encouraging them to find where the story is behind that word, and that's where they can really dive in. And the next step was they completed interviews as the next stage of the assignment with people in their kind of target demographic that they really wanted to focus on that was using that slang word most commonly. And as the final piece of the project, they put all of that research and analysis together and they published their wiki online. So each student wrote an article about a word. So that was that public real life audience piece. And then we did presentations just with each other in class that allowed them to reflect on their learning. So we had that reflection piece happening as well. So that's an example of a kind of relatively theoretical, relatively traditional classroom project that could take this approach, and was actually really fun. I want to talk, though, about an example from Full Sail. And this second example is actually pretty typical of what a lot of projects here at Full Sail look like, where the essential question and the goal are sometimes a little bit more technical, right? It's not necessarily something theoretical and conceptual like, why do our words matter? Because sometimes you're teaching a more technical skill. Sometimes you're teaching something that's very specific to a given field, but a project-based approach can still be adapted even for these more technical goals. So that essential question might be less theoretical or conceptual than in the previous example, and it might be more direct and more technology focused, like what can I create with MIDI, which is a kind of means of programming that students use to create music digitally. So even when the problem they're solving is this really technical one, you can still get students invested and excited by presenting them with that larger goal that they don't quite have the tools to do yet. Okay, what are you going to do in this project? You're going to create a song digitally, and this is what you're going to do. You're going to do it using just this technology. That's your challenge. You don't quite know how to do it yet, but you're going to know by the end of this project. And then we present them with the plan, with the timeline, right? What knowledge and skills do students need to be able to do this? What theoretical knowledge about music do they already have that's going to apply? Or what pieces of equipment do they need to know how to use that they're going to have to use anyway as musicians? How do you make all that equipment talk to each other? What kind of similar things have they done before? So they're coming into this project with a little bit of knowledge. So what do they already know that's going to help them? So a discussion about what those goals are happens, and students are given a timeline of how they're going to develop those skills to get this project done. And they start out by something relatively straightforward, right, with creating some basic sounds. So they're working with a sequencer, which is this kind of analog piece of equipment, and they learn how to take this piece of equipment and make it sound like different instruments. So as they're doing it, they're creating sounds that they might potentially use in this larger project, but they're also just learning the basics of how to navigate this really complicated piece of equipment. And then in the next stage of this project, they play around with those sounds a little bit more. And they use those sounds to create a remix of an existing song. So even though this part doesn't actually become part of their larger project, which is to create their own song, it does teach them how to navigate that piece of hardware in more complex ways, how to put multiple tracks together, how to move stuff around, how to manipulate it, all kinds of stuff that, as a non-musician, I do not myself fully understand. So they're working on developing these skills they need to create that project. And after they've learned how to do this with this sequencer in more or less an analog format, well, then we add another piece of complexity into the mix, right? That, oh, well, now they're going to do this digitally. Now they're going to learn some software to figure out how to take those sounds that they made in the sequencer and make them do even more complex and even weirder things. So they demonstrate first that they can wire all of this stuff together. They take real equipment and they really do it. And show that, okay, I know how to make all of this equipment talk to each other. And then once they've done all of that, they put all of those pieces together. So their end game that they've been building up to this whole time is that they create a song from scratch using this technology. So throughout this whole project, they're working on this large, complicated thing, but they have labs a couple of times a week that are dedicated just to working on this project. So they get that individual attention from their instructors and that dedicated class time that can guide them through the steps. And then where that real world audience comes in, essentially it's kind of up to the students, because now they've learned some really specific technical skills, but they haven't just learned them for the sake of learning them. Once they've created that song, that's theirs. They can do whatever they want with it. They're artists. They could perform it. They could release it. They could keep working on it until it's ready to be released. They could do whatever they want to with it. And then they do their reflection when they move on to the next course. So this is just one project, but it's also a piece of a kind of whole program of project-based learning. And the reason that I chose both of these two really different examples is because while one is more theoretical and fits that model very, very easily, the other one is extremely technical. And maybe that model needs to be adapted a little bit. But what both of these examples hopefully can show you is that a project-based approach can look a lot of different ways and can have a lot of different goals. So whether your goal is to get your students to develop some kind of very specific technical skill, or whether you want to get them to engage in some kind of community service project, or even just to think more deeply about something, what the commonality is here between all of these different types of projects is that the students learn not by being talked at, but by practicing the skill that we want them to learn. They're learning by doing. They know why they're doing it, and they understand how what they're learning and what they're creating can have an actual real world impact beyond the classroom, because that real impact is what's going to reinforce that skill for the students. It's going to help them remember. They may not remember, every math formula they've ever learned in their life, but they're going to remember that project they did. They're going to remember that time that they created a proposal and presented it to their city council. They're going to remember that thing that they made, and that's going to reinforce that learning and those skills. So those are some benefits of a project-based approach that I hope y'all will find useful. So that is essentially what I have for you.